When shooting a film, television show, or commercial, it's vital that all the cameras and audio recorders be synchronized to one another so that the film and audio can be easily aligned and combined during the editing process. It's also essential that the entire team, including the director, editors, visual effects personnel, sound designers, and composer, have a unified system for referencing specific frames of film. To satisfy both of these requirements, we use SMPTE Timecode. And before we continue, I should mention that the following information is important to have a general understanding of, but it can feel a bit complicated and unintuitive at first. Fortunately, when scoring to picture, your digital audio workstation handles most of the intricate tasks, making your job relatively simple. SMPTE Timecode, often referred to as just SMPTE or just Timecode, is a timecode standard proposed by the Society of Motion Picture and Television Engineers and approved by the American National Standards Institute in the 1970s. It timestamps each individual frame of picture, as well as audio, with a unique code using the format hours, minutes, seconds, and frames. Colons are used to separate the digits, except for DropFrame timecode, and we'll get to that in a minute, where the colon before the frames portion is replaced with either a semicolon or a period. The hours, minutes, and seconds function just like a 24-hour clock, so 60 seconds in a minute and 60 minutes in an hour. The number of frames in each second can vary and is based on the timecode's frame rate. The frame rate indicates the speed at which the film or video is recorded and played back. It is measured in frames per second and abbreviated as FPS. The most common frame rates, or speeds, you'll see as a composer for audiovisual media are 23.976 frames per second, which your DAW may round up and display as 23.98 frames per second, 24 frames per second, 29.97 frames per second, 29.97 frames per second drop frame, again we'll get to that in a minute, and 30 frames per second. And if you work with video coming from Europe and a few other countries, you'll also see 25 frames per second. This frame rate is embedded as timecode into the movie file that the filmmaker gives you and provides a standard frame counting reference that everyone on the filmmaking team can use. So when the filmmaker points out something that happens at 1 hour, 4 minutes, 20 seconds, 12 frames, everyone will be looking at the exact same still frame of picture. Since the timecode format is shown as hours, minutes, seconds, and frames, you'd probably assume that it's basically the same as real elapsed time, the only difference being that it includes those extra frame subdivisions. But depending on the frame rate, that's not always the case. Imagine you have a video that was shot at 30 frames per second and that is embedded with 30 frames per second timecode. If the first frame is coded 1 hour, the second frame will be coded 1 hour 1 frame, the third frame will be coded 1 hour 2 frames, all the way to the 30th frame of video, which will be coded 1 hour 29 frames. Since 30 frames went by and the video was shot at 30 frames per second, that means exactly 1 second elapsed. So when the 30th frame of video advances to the 31st frame of video, both the timecode counter and the real elapsed time counter will advance to the next second. In other words, the timecode seconds and real elapsed time seconds will match. But what happens when you use timecode to code 30 frames of video, but that video was recorded and plays back at 29.97 frames per second? Well, in that case, when elapsed real time advances to the next second, the 30th frame won't be finished being displayed because the video only played through 29.97 of the 30 frames in that 1 second. In other words, compared to real elapsed time, the timecode number is late by 0.03 seconds, or the difference between 30 and 29.97. This isn't a huge amount, but for every additional second that goes by, the timecode and elapsed real time will be further misaligned in relation to each other by another 0.03 seconds. This equates to a mismatch of 3.6 seconds every hour. It's important to note, though, that this is not inherently a problem. As long as you and the filmmaker are referencing the same timecode frame rate, this doesn't matter at all. But it can be confusing when the real-time counter and the timecode counter don't match, so it's good to be aware of. Regarding that 29.97 frames per second DropFrame frame rate I said we'd get to, DropFrame is a solution to this very problem of mismatched timecode and elapsed real time. The timecode skips, or drops, 2 frames, frame 0 and frame 1, every time the timecode advances to a new minute, except for multiples of 10 minutes. And to be clear, no frames of video are dropped, only timecode numbers are. This keeps the timecode aligned with RealTime and makes things feel a little more correct. Just be aware that once per minute you will not see frames 0 or 1. As I said, this can all feel a bit confusing and unintuitive, so what do you really need to remember from all of this? Just a few things. The timecode numbers for whole number frame rates and DropFrame frame rates, so 24 frames per second, 25 frames per second, 29.97 frames per second DropFrame, and 30 frames per second, will be perfectly aligned with actual elapsed time. The timecode numbers for non-whole number frame rates and non-DropFrame frame rates, so 23.976 frames per second and 29.97 frames per second, will slowly drift behind the actual elapsed time. Non-DropFrame rates use a colon between the seconds and frames, and DropFrame frame rates use a semicolon or period between the seconds and frames. In the US, the first frame of picture will typically start with the timecode number 1 hour, 0 minutes, 0 seconds, 0 frames, instead of 0 hours, 0 minutes, 0 seconds, 0 frames. The reason for this is that there are often countdowns and information slates before the first frame of picture, and if we started with hour 0 instead of hour 1, all that pre-roll information would have to use negative timecode numbers. And of course, always match your DAW's frame rate to that of the movie you're scoring. So, now that you know what SMPTE Timecode is, let's take a look at some of the ways that you, as a composer, will engage with it. Your first timecode task will be to match your DAW's frame rate. Some DAWs, such as Logic, will recognize the movie's frame rate when you import it and offer to automatically change its frame rate to match. But if yours doesn't, you can easily see the embedded frame rate of any movie by using a program such as QuickTime. Just open the movie, select Show Movie Inspector, and you'll see it listed next to FPS or encoded FPS. And why is this important? Why do the DAW and movie frame rates need to match? Well, imagine that you have a 1-second movie clip of a pulsing orange light. The movie is embedded with 24 frames per second timecode, but you have your DAW's frame rate set to 30 frames per second. As you can see, by the time the movie gets to frame 5, the DAW and movie frame numbers no longer match. If the filmmaker says they want you to hit the orange pulse at frame 21 with a musical embellishment, they will be referring to the second to last pulse, while you will be looking at the third to last pulse. Frame rate mismatches can also cause other inconsistencies. For example, notice that if we advance our DAW from frame 1 to frame 2, we are actually seeing the same movie frame 1. The same goes for frames 6 and 7, 11 and 12, 16 and 17, etc. However, do feel secure that if you forget to set your DAW's frame rate, or if you set it incorrectly, it will not affect the playback speed of the audio or video or otherwise cause major problems. It will just create some minor issues with accurately identifying and syncing to specific frames. Your next interaction with timecode will be as a visual reference. Many of the movie files you score will include the timecode numbers visually embedded into the picture. This is known as Bitsy, or burnt-in timecode. You can also use Bitsy to reference your timecode counter against and make sure your DAW's frame rate is set correctly. If it is, the Bitsy and your timecode counter will align perfectly at every frame. And in cases where the movie file doesn't have Bitsy, your timecode counter serves as a perfect substitute. Other ways you will use SMPTE Timecode include referencing specific SMPTE Timecode positions when doing tempo and marker calculations within your DAW. When you've written a cue and later have to rework it to fit a new cut, you'll rely on timecode numbers in order to help you figure out what has changed and to make sure that everything is once again properly aligned. During spotting sessions for projects such as films that contain multiple music cues, all of the music notes as to where cues should begin and end will be written in terms of timecode numbers. And similarly, as you work on such a project, you'll need to provide cue sheets, which list the timecode position of each cue so that the editors know where to place your music files in their edit sessions.